Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Dodge City. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1883, when Dodge City had begun to slow its wild rhythm. The gunfights had waned, the cattle drives grew shorter, and the nights were quieter, though never entirely still. The streets were lined with weary saloons and half-abandoned stores. It was then that a stranger arrived, introducing himself as Dr. Alistair Grieg, a physician trained, he said, in Edinburgh and London. He came by rail, stepping down with a black valise and an English overcoat unsuited to Kansas dust. The local paper mentioned him briefly. A foreign doctor has taken rooms near the stockyards, said to be skilled in both man and beast. Few took notice. Dodge City had seen every sort of man come and go. Grieg rented a narrow building on the edge of town, where the sound of hooves never ceased. He hung a modest sign, A. Grieg, M.D., Surgery and Veterinary Services. Those who met him spoke of his precision, his odd calm, and the way his eyes lingered too long on wounds. He rarely smiled. The first to grow uneasy were the handlers at the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe depot, who saw him receiving shipments marked medical instruments and preservatives. One crate leaked a brownish fluid that burned through the floorboards. When asked, the doctor replied, "It is only tissue, for study." By spring, townsfolk whispered about the lights in his windows long past midnight. The lamplight flickered like a heartbeat. The blacksmith's boy claimed to hear muffled hammering and low, rhythmic breathing that didn't sound human. The sheriff brushed it off. Frontier towns had worse sins than odd do, octors. Yet small details lingered in records. Burial permits signed for mixed remains, receipts for carbolic acid in bulk. The Dodge City Historical Archives, which survive today, and are briefly noted in the Wikipedia article on Dodge City, confirm that several out-of-town traders complained of a putrid odor near the eastern yards that spring. The doctor himself rarely left his practice except for the rail office, where he sent and received parcels wrapped too tightly for comfort. Children dared each other to peer through his shutters. One, Samuel Pike, later testified as an old man. He had a horse stretched open on the table. I thought it dead, but when he lifted the hide, I saw something white, like a man's hand. No one believed him. Dodge had its share of wild tales, and the law didn't waste time on imagination. But the stories didn't stop. They multiplied. The gravedigger found fresh earth disturbed behind the clinic. The undertaker was asked for coffins, without lids. By June, 3 horses were missing from the livery. Their owner, Thomas Greeley, accused Grieg outright. The doctor smiled faintly and said, "They've been made useful." Days later, Greeley was found dead in a ditch, trampled beyond recognition. Grieg signed the death certificate himself. And just like that, suspicion froze. No one challenged him again. By late summer of 1883, the heat over Dodge City turned heavy and sour. The flies came in swarms, clinging to windows and rail cars. It was around this time that the smell near Dr. Grieg's clinic grew impossible to ignore. The butcher, Mr. Hanlon, wrote in his ledger, "The English doctor's yard stinks worse than any tallow pit, smells of rot and sweet oil." Still, nobody moved against him. Dodge was a transient town. Men vanished, animals died, and the wind buried what people wished to forget. But those who lived nearby began to speak in low tones. They said they heard something pacing inside the stable after dark. Others said the noises were wrong, deliberate, almost mechanical. One surviving sheriff's memorandum dated August 9, 1883, records a complaint from Ellen Rourke, deputy clerk. Dr. A. Grieg continues to file burial requests for livestock, frequently without veterinarian witness. The quantity and frequency exceed common need. One permit lists mixed remains. He refused explanation. The document was never acted upon. Sheriff Henry Madsen, who'd inherited the post after Bat Masterson left town, wrote a single note at the bottom, "Not priority, likely eccentricity." That same week, a ranch hand named Jonas Beck began working under Grieg. The man was seen unloading crates at night, long, narrow ones, roughly the shape of torsos. When asked what they contained, Beck replied, "Practice pieces." He quit within a month, or so Grieg claimed. But when the blacksmith's son found Beck's hat nailed above the stable door, the boys started calling it the doctor's warning. There's one mention of Grieg in a Dodge City newspaper column from that autumn. It reads almost kindly, "Our local physician continues his experiments to prevent disease in valuable stock. A man of science ahead of his time." The editor, later interviewed, said the doctor had provided him with whiskey and medical ointment for his rheumatism. He never saw the clinic's inside. Then came the discovery that turned rumor into dread. During a flash flood in October, the Arkansas River overflowed its banks, washing debris from behind the clinic into the shallows. Among the reeds, 2 boys found the carcass of a horse, belly split and stitched clumsily with cord. Inside were bones, human, unmistakably so, with fingers curled like they had tried to escape. The marshal filed a report, but never followed through. The entry reads simply, "Bodies mixed, unable to distinguish species. Recommend immediate burial." It was the last official line written about the matter until the following spring. After that, townsfolk started crossing the street rather than walk past the clinic. Mothers told their children not to look toward the barn, and at night, when the wind shifted east, they swore they heard the pounding of hooves, not galloping, but rhythmic, like a heart that refused to stop beating. By the start of 1884, the winter air over Dodge City carried the scent of smoke, lie, and unease. The freight yard men spoke of strange crates leaving the doctor's property at night. Barrels labeled specimens for preservation. A clerk later told investigators 1 barrel leaked, and a hand whiter than any man's slipped into view before being hastily covered. The matter was not pursued. Dr. Alistair Grieg continued his practice as if nothing had changed. He treated the wounded, doctored lame horses, and even tended to the sheriff's coughing fit. Yet people began to notice how he always wore gloves, even indoors, and that his sleeves were stained with something that did not wash out. He claimed it was iodine, but the undertaker, Mr. Leary, said the stains looked too dark and too alive. Records from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway indicate that Grieg ordered 6 barrels of carbolic acid between February and March. The official purpose? Sanitation. But according to Deputy Clerk Ellen Rourke, who kept every receipt, he paid for them with cash wrapped in linen as though hiding from the touch of metal. That same winter, the reverend who'd once welcomed him, Josiah Kent, wrote his final entry in the parish ledger. The doctor called after evening service. He spoke again of merging life, of learning the language of muscle and tendon. He said he had found a way to silence decay. I told him it was God's boundary. He smiled and said, "Boundaries are the habits of the timid." Not long after, the Reverend left Dodge City altogether. The Wikipedia record on Dodge City notes that many professionals came west chasing anonymity. Surgeons, apothecaries, and failed inventors who preferred frontier silence to accountability. Grieg fit perfectly into that fold, disappearing into a town already accustomed to ghosts. The first disappearance that stuck was Jonas Bess. Keys. His belongings were found untouched in a rented room, but his wages remained unpaid. Dr. Grieg told the marshal Beck had taken sick and left for Topeka. No one verified it. Weeks later, a freight handler found Beck's pocket knife inside a pile of ash behind the clinic. In March, after a storm, the stable door was found ajar. The horse stall nearest the wall was soaked in blood, old, dark, and clotted. The doctor's response was clinical, a birth gone wrong, but no one remembered any pregnant mares. From that point, the townsfolk avoided his street entirely. The sound of hammering continued deep into the night. Sometimes it was slow and steady, other times frantic, as though Grieg was trying to keep something from coming apart. A letter written by Henry Doolin, the telegraph operator, dated April 2, 1884, gives the first mention of the phrase, "filled horses." It said he's putting men in them, that he opens their bellies and makes them one. I do not believe it, yet the smell, it makes belief unnecessary. In that same month, Dr. Grieg's signature disappeared from the county ledger. The pages after are blank, save for a single note in Ellen Rourke's hand. Premises closed for inspection, found residue, surgical tools, hides, and one human jawbone. Doctor unaccounted for. By dawn the next morning his clinic was empty. The lamp still burned, the tea on his desk still warm, and his black coat still hanging by the door. Outside, the muddy ground bore the prints of hooves leading nowhere. The investigation into Dr. Alistair Grieg's disappearance began quietly and ended almost before it started. Sheriff Henry Madsen gathered a small party to inspect the property. His report, now preserved in the Ford County Archives, describes a scene of unnatural composition. Inside the barn, the air was thick with rot and sweet chemicals. The sheriff's men opened the cellar doors and found what appeared to be rows of dissected animals, but the anatomy didn't add up. The largest specimen, described as horse-sized, stitched through the abdomen, contained ribs belonging to two separate creatures. A pair of human arms had been sewn where the animal's forelegs should have been. The sheriff's note concluded, "Subjects unfit for display, ordered destruction." The remains were burned in a trench behind the property, but the fire would not take easily. Witnesses said it hissed and spat as though the flesh refused to dry. By the third day, most of Dodge City had heard whispers of what was found. The official explanation printed in the Dodge City Times called it a veterinary experiment gone foul, and the matter was laid to rest. Yet a rumor persisted that before the flames died, one of the stitched carcasses moved. The freight clerk, Walter Lemming, later testified in a closed hearing that he'd seen a figure resembling Grieg on the edge of the prairie the same week. He rode no horse, Lemming said, but the sound of hooves followed him anyway. The statement was struck from the record for lack of evidence. Within a month, every trace of the doctor vanished. His journals, once kept in neat rows on a shelf, had been torn apart or burned. Only fragments survived, rescued by Ellen Rourke, the deputy clerk who had grown suspicious long before the sheriff did. One fragment read, "To prevent rot, one must teach tissue to remember itself. The horse remembers the field. A man remembers the wound. Between them lies continuity." The handwriting grew erratic near the bottom, letters pressed too deep into the paper, as though written in haste. The remaining staff at the rail yard began complaining of strange noises near the empty barn. They described hooves in the dark, muffled breathing, and a rhythmic pounding under the floor. The sheriff dismissed it all, saying the soil was settling from the recent fire. Still, the yard workers refused to go near after sunset. Meanwhile, reports trickled in from neighboring towns. A man matching Grieg's description had been seen in Garden City, traveling under the name Dr. Gray. Another sighting came from Las Animas, where a freight foreman said the stranger purchased a horse with more scars than hair. The Wikipedia record on Dodge City mentions this period as one of rapid decline. The rail routes shifted, the cattle trade slowed, and many of the older businesses shuttered. In that vacuum, stories like Grieg's festered, half memory, half curse. By the end of 1884, the building was torn down. The new owner, a cattle merchant, tried to use the site for storage. Within weeks, his workers complained of illness, nausea, vertigo, and nightmares. They swore they heard scraping beneath the floorboards, like hooves dragging over wood. One evening, as the foreman locked the door, he noticed prints in the dirt, not of men or horses, but something in between, pressed deep as though the ground itself had shifted to let it through. He quit the next morning, left Dodge City, and never returned. In the weeks following the barn's destruction, Dodge City tried to forget. The newspaper stopped printing any mention of Dr. Alistair Grieg. The sheriff's log was trimmed, witness notes were misplaced, and what little evidence remained was quietly stored in the courthouse basement under the heading Unresolved Veterinary Matter. But forgetting does not mean erasing. The smell of carbolic acid still clung to the eastern edge of town, and every heavy rain seemed to draw something foul up from the ground. The Ford County Courier for January 1885 carried a small notice, just 2 lines. Unknown vagrant discovered near the freight tracks, suffering from chemical burns, claimed to have been inside the horse, died before sunrise. No physician signed the death certificate. The undertaker recorded only a single word for cause: compounded. Those who handled the body said the man's skin was strangely taut, as if stretched too far, and that his spine showed signs of surgical manipulation. The sheriff ordered a quiet burial. The grave marker simply read, "Unidentified." In the months that followed, more rumors surfaced. Freight men spoke of a rider seen at dusk along the old cattle trail, an upright figure draped in a long coat, moving beside a horse that made no sound. Some said the two cast only one shadow. By midsummer, even the most pragmatic townsfolk admitted something was wrong with the soil where the clinic once stood. Nothing grew there. Not the hardy prairie grass, not weeds, not even the creeping vines that took every other fence post. When the wind blew across that patch, it carried a sound like low breathing. A telegram preserved in the Kansas Medical Society's correspondence files shows that the board received a letter from Topeka asking if a man named A. Grieg had ever been licensed in Kansas. The reply, dated July 1885, reads, "No record found, possibly forests. Agent trained. Recommend inquiry to Territorial Archives." No further letters followed. Ellen Rourke, now working as a court clerk in Wichita, sent one last packet of papers to the county office before she left Dodge for good. Inside were copies of the doctor's supply orders and a final note written in her careful hand. He spoke of continuation. If he has succeeded, he will not stop. She never returned. The Wikipedia history of Dodge City describes how, after 1885, the town's character shifted. The cattle barons moved on. The law became less vigilant. The old ghost stories of gunfighters and haunted hotels were replaced by this quieter one: the doctor who filled horses with men, and perhaps himself among them. Years later, when surveyors planned a new rail spur through the abandoned lot, their horses refused to cross it. One worker wrote that the animals snorted and stamped as if scenting another of their kind beneath the earth. They rerouted the line half a mile south. And though the land was eventually fenced off, travelers passing through Dodge on moonless nights claimed to see a pale figure standing by that fence, head bowed, gloved hands folded, as if still waiting for the next delivery. By 1886, Dodge City had changed. The cattle business waned, the gamblers moved on, and the old saloons closed their shutters for good. Yet on the outskirts, near the burnt remains of the Grieg property, unease lingered like smoke that refused to disperse. The town called the area the Doctor's Quarter, and though no official record named it so, everyone understood what it meant. The land was purchased that year by a small-time rancher named Elias Doran, who claimed he didn't believe in ghost stories. He tore down what was left of the clinic and built a low stable on the same ground. For a time it prospered. The soil was firm, water nearby, and travelers paid good money to rest their horses there. But by the next spring, things began to turn. Elias wrote a letter to the Ford County assessor that survives today. "Sir, I request you to remove my property from valuation. The animals die fast here. They eat and fall. Their hides harden like tallow. At night they kick at nothing. And I hear the same hammering they said the Englishman made. I am leaving." He was gone by June. His wife remained only long enough to bury 2 colts that had died within hours of each other. She told a neighbor they shook as if the air were inside them, trying to get out. Around that same time, the local telegraph operator, Henry Doolin, began keeping notes about unexplained interference on the line near the eastern tracks. His entries are curious. Short bursts between 2 and 3 a.m., rhythmic clicks in patterns of 4. When translated through Morse, read as DCDC repeatedly. Could be wire damage. But no damage was found. Years later, those same letters would be interpreted differently: DC for Doctor or Dodge City. The county attempted to sell the land twice more, both times to buyers who withdrew after visiting. The second buyer, Mr. Callan, wrote that the ground was soft as if breathing underneath, and that one of his men had fallen waist deep when the soil suddenly gave way. Nothing was buried there, he claimed, yet something moved. During these years, as Dodge City's lawlessness began to fade into history, old stories re-emerged as folklore. The Wikipedia account of Dodge City's late 19th century period mentions this transition, from violence of men to fear of memory. The town traded gunfire for whispers. By 1890, only 2 buildings remained near the site, a hay barn and a storage shed for the railroad. Workers complained of constant tapping from within the walls, though no vermin were ever found. The night watchman, Reuben Haskett, left a note in the freight ledger after his final shift. "He's still working down there. Hammer never stops. Smells like iron and rain." The next morning, the shed door was ajar, and Haskett was gone. His lantern was found upright beside a single hoofprint filled with clear water. There had been no rain that week. After that, the yard was sealed and marked as condemned by the rail office. No one protested. The line curved away, the trains passed at a distance, and Dodge City moved on, or tried to. But old places remember, and sometimes they remember too well. By the mid-1890s, Dodge City had quieted into something resembling order. The saloon lights dimmed, the gunmen gone or buried, and the wind carried more dust than voices. But near the rail spur that once bordered the Grieg property, travelers began reporting things that didn't fit with this new civility. The telegraph men called it the whisper line, faint tapping sounds that repeated every night just before 2 o'clock, even when the wires were disconnected. The new sheriff, Orrin Lathrop, dismissed it as superstition left over from wilder times. Yet the complaints kept coming. Riders passing through on cattle runs claimed their horses balked at a particular stretch of ground east of town. One drover described the feeling as like standing over a hollow chest that's still breathing. In 1893, a construction crew sent to expand the spur unearthed what the foreman first thought were old fence posts buried in clay. They were bones, large ones, heavy as stone, arranged in an arc as if forming the curve of a rib cage. The sheriff ordered the discovery sealed until a medical man could look. No such man ever came. The next morning the trench had caved in, though the weather had been dry. The story might have died there, except for a letter preserved in the archives of Fort Dodge Hospital, dated September 1893. It was written by Dr. Marion Prentice, who had traveled through the area weeks later. The locals speak of an English doctor who made his experiments on horses. They showed me a skull unearthed by recent works. Its teeth were human. No one knows what became of that skull. Over the next few years, the legend hardened. Children called the winds that rose from the prairie the doctor's breath. Ranchers warned new hires never to stable their animals too close to the old yard. A few skeptics investigated, mostly drifters chasing ghost stories for drink money. None stayed long. A traveler's diary found in 1901 contained a short passage written in a shaky hand. Slept near the freight ruins. Heard hooves at midnight. No prints in the morning, but a smell of smoke and salt. Something brushed my tent. Soft, like hide. The Wikipedia entry for Dodge City mentions this period only briefly, noting that by the turn of the century, much of the old town had been rebuilt and its darker histories buried under new streets. But the people who lived there didn't forget. In churchyards and taverns, the tale grew teeth. They said the doctor had not died at all, that his experiments had worked too well, and that he had traded places with the very beasts he filled. When the wind rose from the east, the elders would lower their voices. "Don't look toward the yards," they'd whisper. "That's where he walks still, the man who taught horses to carry more than their own." By 1900, the old freight path in Dodge City was nearly erased from the map. The railway expanded south, new buildings rose, and people said time had finally buried what the fire hadn't. But some things, as the locals learned, do not stay buried. That spring, the railroad contracted a crew to dig a drainage trench near the condemned plot once known as the Grieg property. The men were new to Dodge, immigrants from Missouri who hadn't heard the stories. On the third day, their foreman, Samuel Dean, filed an incident report now preserved in the county archives. His words were spare, but unsettling. "We struck a hollow space 3 feet down. The soil collapsed. Inside lay bones, equine, partial, but jointed with smaller ones. The smell of lye was strong. We refilled and moved the trench north." When questioned later, Dean added that his team refused to continue, claiming the ground sounded like breathing when they tried to dig again. The work stopped, and that section of the trench remains unfinished to this day. The sheriff at the time, Edwin Crane, kept a notebook on unexplained events in the county. One entry, dated June 9, 1900, reads, "Young boy claims to have seen a man standing knee-deep in the marsh near the old clinic site. Bald head, great mustache, long coat. When called to, the figure turned and faded into fog." The boy's name was never written down, but the description was familiar. So was the location. Within a year, livestock began vanishing again from nearby pens. Small cases at first, 1 mule, a few cattle. Then one morning a rancher found his best horse dead in the field, chest split open, entrails replaced with rags, soaked in a thick, oily fluid. The sheriff's report blamed a wild animal mutilation, but the locals whispered a single name: Grieg. The Dodge City historical account, referenced in the Wikipedia article, notes how the town's population began declining around this time. The cattle trails were closing, and the younger generation sought new lives elsewhere. What remained was a silence thicker than any sermon, punctuated by the wind and the low echo of hooves that no one could trace. In 1903, a fire broke out at the County Records Building. Dozens of files were lost, including those labeled Dr. A. Grieg and Unknown Remains, 1884. The cause was listed as faulty wiring, though the town had yet to install electrical lines. A few pages survived. Among them was a note in the hand of Ellen Rourke, dated years earlier. He believed the horse remembered life. He believed a man could borrow that memory if the flesh were joined correctly. After the fire, the townsfolk stopped speaking of him entirely. But silence does not end a story. It only deepens it. Visitors passing through Dodge at the turn of the century described strange impressions near the edge of town, hooves where there were no horses, and a faint smell of smoke even in rain. One woman, a schoolteacher traveling to Topeka, wrote in her journal that she saw a figure pacing beside the old track at twilight. "It moved slow, as though listening," she wrote. "And when I looked away, the sound of hooves followed me all the way to the inn." By 1906, Dodge City had become quieter still, its rowdy years folded neatly into history books, its saloons replaced by churches and trading posts. But the old eastern edge, where the Grieg property once stood, remained empty. The ground there was cracked and pale, as if scorched beneath the surface. Children would not play near it. Cattle avoided it. Even the weeds stopped at its border, as though remembering what the soil had once held. That spring, the Kansas State Herald published a short piece under the headline, "Anatomical Relics Found in Dodge City Dig." It described a traveling archaeologist, Professor Leander Myers, who claimed to have unearthed a rusted medical kit and fragments of journal paper preserved in lime. The kit, according to his notes, bore the initials AG, scratched faintly into the handle. Myers later lectured in Topeka, stating, "The writings suggest a frontier physician attempting early grafting procedures, man to beast, beast to man. They read more like prayers than experiments." The kit was sent to the University Museum, but within a year it vanished from storage. Only the professor's sketches remain, showing surgical hooks shaped oddly like bridles. That same year, a news station watchman, Caleb Warner, took the night post near the abandoned freight spur. His logbook survives in the Dodge City Historical Society collection. Over 3 weeks, he made 9 entries mentioning hoof sounds with no visible source. The final entry, dated May 21st, reads, "Light from the east tonight, like a lantern swaying. Saw a figure by fence, no horse with him. Sound of hooves continued for several minutes after he was gone." Warner left Dodge City the next day, and never returned. Meanwhile, the Wikipedia record on Dodge City's development around the turn of the century notes that the rail expansion briefly revived the town's economy, but only breeded fly. The eastern yards, where the Grieg Clinic had once stood, were deliberately excluded from the new plans. Engineers cited unstable subsoil. In 1908, work crews attempting to lay pipe uncovered a slab of concrete buried 2 feet deep. Beneath it was a metal tag reading Specimen 12, Equus Homo. The find was hushed, though one worker, James Callow, wrote to his wife describing the site. His letter survives. It looked like a ribcage stitched in half, human on one side, horse on the other. But what made me drop my shovel was the nails, too new, like someone had fixed it just yesterday. 2 days later, Callow fell into a trench at the site and broke his neck. The others refused to return, and the city filled the hole with lime. By 1910, only the oldest residents still spoke of the doctor. They would not say his name at night. Instead, they referred to him as the farrier, a word once meaning a horse healer, but here meaning something else entirely. And on certain evenings, when the wind crossed the plains just right, people claimed to hear that same sound. The slow hammering of metal against bone, steady and patient, like someone continuing work long abandoned by the living. By 1911, Dodge City had the look of a town that had outgrown its own ghosts. The cattle boom was long gone, the gunfighters immortalized in dime novels, and the new generation preferred telephones and electric lights to old tales whispered over whiskey. But the land does not forget as easily as people do. That spring, the city council approved plans to repurpose the unused freight land on the eastern edge, the very ground where Dr. Alistair Grieg's clinic once stood, into a small depot for mail storage. It seemed practical enough. The soil was cheap, the location convenient. The mayor called it an effort to reclaim history from its own shadow. But shadows have a way of reclaiming themselves. Construction began in March. Within days, workers complained of the smell. At first, they blamed stagnant rainwater, but even after the pits were drained, the odor remained, a mixture of sweet oil, rust, and something older. One of the foremen, Eugene Barrett, filed an incident note with the rail office. Men report dizziness, nausea, and nosebleeds near East Foundation. Horses refuse to enter lot. Soil feels warm beneath surface. The lot was tested for gas pockets. None were found. The work slowed, and by mid-April, only half the foundation was laid. On the morning of the 14th, the night watchman failed to report. When they found him, his body lay beside the tool shed, rigid and pale. His face was twisted, as if he'd died trying to listen for something. The coroner's report mentioned no external injuries, only that his lungs were coated in a residue resembling preservation wax. The depot project was quietly abandoned. By summer, the incident had become a whisper again, another strange story among so many in the old cowtown. But a letter from Professor Leander Myers, the same man who'd found Grieg's surgical kit years earlier, resurfaced around this time. It was adieu, rest to the Kansas State Historical Society, and contained a chilling observation. The Dodge case, the one concerning the English doctor, seems to align with the earliest recorded attempts at xenografting. If his notes are genuine, he was decades ahead of his peers. What he sought was not resurrection, but adaptation, to make the living endure by replacing the perishable with the perpetual. His letter ended abruptly. I fear he succeeded, and that the success was not his own. The following year, Myers was found dead in his office, his throat constricted by a length of surgical cord. No culprit was ever found. His papers vanished soon after, leaving only a mention in university logs. Files misplaced during reorganization. That same year, 1912, the Wikipedia recorded history of Dodge City notes a small but curious entry. The eastern rail yard listed as permanently closed due to unstable ground. The official reason was subsidence caused by old lime pits, but those who lived nearby spoke differently. They said they heard something moving under the soil at night, a slow, dragging rhythm that grew louder before storms. In the dry months that followed, children dared each other to run past the fence at dusk. One, a boy named Oliver McKean, later recounted to his granddaughter, "You could hear the breath coming from the earth, like a horse about to run, only deeper. I think it was waiting." By the winter of 1912, snow had covered the lot entirely. For a brief time, Dodge looked pure again, quiet, modern. But beneath that white stillness lay a century of silence stitched together, the doctor, the horses, and the people who tried to forget them. Because sometimes, in certain corners of the world, history does not end. It just slows its heartbeat. The winter of 1913 was a hard one for Dodge City. The blizzards came early, burying the plains in silence and salt. The cold made the rail lines sing like metal throats in the wind. On clear nights, you could hear the echo of that hum far across the frozen flats, steady, low, and mechanical. Some said it was the sound of the depot machinery freezing. Others, the older ones, whispered that it was the doctor's hammer, striking still beneath the earth. It was during that season that the last man to officially inspect the Grieg property took his notes. A land surveyor named Frank Dalrymple, sent from Topeka to assess the old condemned tract. His field journal survives, though the final pages are smeared with something dark, perhaps ink, perhaps not. "Ground remains soft," he wrote, "too soft for frost this deep. Subsoil temperature inconsistent. Instruments record faint movement, tremor, or pulse." Dalrymple stayed 3 days. He lodged at the Red Roof Inn and was seen each morning walking out with a lantern before dawn, marking lines in the snow. On the third morning, he didn't return. When the stable hand went to fetch him, only his coat was found, frozen upright near the fence post, the sleeves stiff and outstretched as though holding invisible reins. The snow beneath it was perfectly smooth, no footprints leading to or from the spot. The report reached the sheriff 2 days later. The body was never found. The county clerk logged the matter under exposure due to inclement weather, though the temperature had risen above freezing that week. By spring, the townsfolk began noticing something strange near the rail embankment. The snow there melted in precise lines, curved and symmetrical, like ribs revealed beneath the thaw. The children started calling the pattern the horse cage. They said it appeared only at dawn, then vanished with the first wind. One family then
It lived nearest to the old plot. The McCaffertys claimed their well water turned sweet and cloudy during those weeks. They abandoned their property within a month, leaving everything behind, even their horses. The animals were found days later standing at the edge of the Grieg lot, silent, heads lowered, as if listening to the ground. The Wikipedia account of Dodge City mentions how, around this time, the town began modernizing, paving streets, installing telegraph poles, raising brick buildings. The people thought themselves free of their old ghosts, yet the ghost they couldn't see was the one woven into their soil. No photograph from those years includes the eastern side of town. Artists painted over it entirely. Then came the letter that reopened the past. A young doctor from St. Louis, Dr. Frederick Lorne, wrote to the Dodge City Council requesting information about an English surgeon by the name of A. Grieg, who might have practiced there decades earlier. He claimed to possess a series of anatomical sketches identical to those once rumored to be found in Dodge. The council replied there was no such man in their records. Still, Dr. Lorne arrived that summer to investigate. Locals recalled him as polite, curious, and insistent on visiting the rail grounds. He stayed at the boarding house for 3 nights. On the 4th, his horse was found tethered outside the fence, foam at its mouth, eyes wide. The saddle was torn, as if from within. Lorne's medical bag lay open beside it, filled with bones too small to belong to any animal of that size. No one saw the doctor again. When the sheriff searched his room, he found a letter written but never sent. The method is sound. The division between man and beast was only ever administrative. The tissue remembers everything. After that, the room was sealed, the letter filed, and the matter once again forgotten, or at least buried in the only way Dodge City ever buried anything, quietly, under dust. The year 1915 marked what some historians later called
the second silence of Dodge City. The rail yards to the east were officially decommissioned that spring, and the land that had once belonged to Dr. Alistair Grieg was left fenced and untouched. The townspeople thought it would finally rest. But strange things thrive in neglect. That summer, a family named Broderick moved into a small house less than a quarter-mile from the old site. They were recent arrivals from Wichita, quiet, hard-working people who didn't heed local superstition. Thomas Broderick, the father, kept horses and worked for the freight depot. He dismissed the whispers of the doctor's ground as old prairie nonsense. For a while, life was peaceful, until the animals began to change. In late July, Thomas wrote a letter to his brother in Topeka, preserved today in a private collection. "Something's wrong with the mare. She's restless. She won't eat unless the stall door faces east. The others are spooked, too. They don't sleep. Sometimes I find them all staring toward the fence line, heads low, like they're listening." His wife, Evelyn, later told neighbors that her husband started having night terrors, waking up gasping for air. He said he could hear breathing, she recalled, but it wasn't his own. Then, one evening in early August, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. The wind tore loose the fence posts near the Grieg property. In the morning, Broderick's stable was empty. Not a trace of the animals remained. No hoofprints, no broken boards. Only the smell of wet earth and a pattern of indentations in the mud, like ribs pressed outward from beneath. 2 days later, they found Thomas himself. His body lay face down in the pasture, skin pale and stretched, as if pulled too tight over the frame. The coroner noted something impossible. The shape of his chest was irregular, elongated, resembling the cavity of a large animal. Evelyn left Dodge City that same night and never returned. The town filed it as an unexplained livestock incident. The paperwork vanished within a month when the courthouse basement flooded. At this point, Dodge City's legend was already being studied by outsiders. A journalist from the Topeka Herald, Clara Meston, arrived that autumn to gather accounts. Her surviving notes describe a population caught between reason and fear. They speak of the doctor not as a ghost, but as a principle, as if he were something that got into the soil, into the breath of the animals, into the air itself. They do not say his name, yet they all describe the same sound at night, hooves moving, then stopping, as though waiting for command. Meston interviewed several old-timers, including Deputy Ellen Rourke, then in her 70s. Rourke's statement was brief but sharp. He didn't vanish. He succeeded. There's no man to hang when the crime has no body. The journalist left Dodge City soon after and published nothing. Her editor received only a telegram that read, "Too many versions of the same truth. Leaving before it learns me too." By the end of that decade, even the youngest citizens knew not to walk east of the rail yard after dusk. The land was posted as unsafe, the fence reinforced with barbed wire. But travelers still spoke of seeing a pale figure standing at its edge, unmoving, hands clasped behind his back, a posture too proper for a ghost, too patient for a man. They said that if you looked long enough, you'd hear it, the faint rhythmic hammering that once echoed from the old clinic. 3 strikes, a pause, then 3 again. The pattern of someone still working. By 1918, the world had grown darker in ways the old frontier could never have imagined. The Great War had ended overseas, and the Spanish flu crept silently through the American plains, taking the weak, the young, and the healthy alike. Dodge City, like much of Kansas, mourned more than it counted. Mass graves filled the prairie edges, and the townspeople, accustomed to burying others' sins, found themselves now burying their own. In the midst of this, something else returned. It began when the railroad company, desperate for storage space, proposed reopening the long-abandoned eastern yard. The land had lain untouched for nearly 20 years, its boundaries marked only by warped posts and rusted chain. But wartime economy left little room for superstition. Laborers were hired to clear it. By the end of summer, half the fence was down. One of those men, Patrick O'Neill, would later tell his wife what he saw before he left Dodge City for good.
There's something under that soil. When the plow cut through, the earth bled black, and the smell, it weren't death, not exactly, but something too close to remember. Within a week, 3 of his fellow workers fell ill. The local doctor, a German émigré named Dr. Ernst Vogel, diagnosed chemical poisoning, likely from buried lime or tar. But one of the sick men, before dying, insisted on being heard. The nurse, Mildred Carson, recorded his final words. It was breathing. The dirt was breathing. The work was halted. The rail company sent a letter to Topeka requesting an environmental assessment. No reply ever came. The influenza was at its peak then, and official attention lay elsewhere. The ground remained open, a half-dug wound on the edge of town. Through the autumn of 1918, the townsfolk stayed indoors. Churches filled with prayers, then with coffins. Yet some said the sickness spread differently near the eastern yard. Bodies taken from that area decayed faster, their veins turning dark as if infused with pitch. Reverend Jonathan Bell, who helped bury them, noted that the horses pulling the carts refused to pass the Grieg lot. They reared and wept like men. The Wikipedia record of Dodge City makes no mention of this year beyond the influenza toll and a brief note about population decline. History has a way of simplifying what it cannot explain. But a collection of letters preserved at the Ford County Museum paints another picture. A town fraying at its edges, haunted by 2 plagues, one of disease, the other of memory. When the epidemic finally broke in early 1919, the remaining townspeople organized a cleanup. They burned infected bedding, disinfected wells, and carted away what the dead no longer needed. The volunteers who went near the eastern yard returned pale and shaking. Sheriff Crane, now an old man himself, reportedly told the council, "We should have let that ground burn itself clean years ago. Whatever he left, there's been waiting for company." The area was fenced again, this time with steel. The county declared it condemned due to unstable chemical contamination. Yet no sample of contamination was ever recorded. The last entry in that year's council ledger reads, in handwriting not like the others, "If the doctor wanted permanence, he found it." For the next decade, the town avoided that site entirely. Travelers still passed through Dodge, as they always had, but no one stayed long. The air had changed. The cattle paths curved wider, and the wind, when it blew from the east, carried the faint scent of formaldehyde mixed with rain. It was said that the horses, those few that remained, would sometimes lift their heads at night and stare toward the old yard, their ears twitching, as though listening for a command they once knew, but could no longer obey. By 1921, Dodge City had begun to reinvent itself, polishing its image for the modern century. Newspapers called it a city reborn, eager to trade its past of blood and dust for something respectable. Tourists arrived by rail to see the Old West, neatly packaged as nostalgia. Gunfight reenactments, wooden storefronts, and a few tamed legends. But among the town's efforts to forget, there was one place no one included on any tour map, the fenced field east of the tracks. The city survey marked it only as Plot 47, Condemned Soil. Few knew that beneath that label lay the former clinic and home of Dr. Alistair Grieg, the man whose story had never quite died. In that same year, a group of high school students dared each other to cross the fence after dark. They brought a lantern and whiskey, the way boys always do when courting fear. One of them, Joseph Harlan, later confessed what happened in a shaky statement given to the sheriff. "We were only in there a minute. The ground wasn't right. It moved. I swear it breathed under my feet, and there was this sound, like horses walking in a circle, slow and heavy, but we couldn't see them." The sheriff dismissed it as nerves and liquor, but 2 nights later, Joseph's younger brother found him sleepwalking barefoot along the edge of the field, muttering the words, "He's calling them back." Around this time, the Dodge City Globe printed a small feature on the town's ghost stories, naming the old Grieg lot among them. It was treated like folklore, a quaint local curiosity. Yet the article caught the attention of a historian from Topeka, Professor Raymond Delmar, who had once studied under Leander Myers, the same academic who'd investigated the doctor's surgical remains decades earlier. Delmar arrived that winter, intent on separating myth from fact. He spent 6 weeks in Dodge, interviewing old residents, reading courthouse fragments, and even gaining access to what little remained of Grieg's confiscated papers. His last entry in his travel diary, preserved today in the archives of the Kansas Historical Society, reads, "The patterns are consistent. He was not seeking resurrection but endurance, a new vessel for consciousness, free of the limits of decay. I believe the process was incomplete or ongoing." Delmar checked out of his hotel the next morning. The clerk remembered he left on foot before dawn, carrying a satchel and a lantern. Neither he nor the satchel was ever found. A week later, a rancher repairing the fence near the Grieg plot discovered the fresh imprint of a boot beside a horse's hoof, just one of each, pressed deep into the frozen mud, circling the field as if two beings shared one step. When word spread, the council ordered the area sealed again, this time with iron posts driven 12 feet deep. The sheriff posted a warning sign reading, "Hazardous ground, entry forbidden." But the people already knew. They didn't go near, not out of law, but out of instinct. The Wikipedia entry on Dodge City briefly mentions that the 1920s brought a revival of civic pride and modernization. It omits, of course, the strange local reports from that same decade. Horses found dead with no visible wounds, wagon wheels turning backward in still air, and faint rhythmic noises echoing under the new depot platform. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. By now, only the oldest citizens remembered the name Grieg. To everyone else, he was only a whisper, a legend without a face. But for those who lived nearest to the condemned plot, the nights carried reminders. The smell of formaldehyde on the wind and the sound of a lantern swinging where no hand held it. Dodge City wanted its past to stay in books and museums. Yet every so often, when the ground thawed and the wind came from the east, everything beneath the soil seemed to disagree. By 1924, Dodge City was dressing itself in progress. Electricity, paved streets, new automobiles gliding over ground that once knew only dust and hooves. Yet out past the glow of the gaslights, on the outskirts where the old Grieg property slept beneath its rusted fence, the modern world felt far away. The land remained untouched, its silence out of step with the bustle around it. People called it the Still Patch. That summer, a traveling photographer named Albert Riggs passed through town. He was documenting vanishing relics of the frontier for a Kansas heritage exhibit, churches, stage depots, and forgotten homesteads. The sheriff warned him not to photograph Plot 47, but curiosity is its own sickness. Riggs later wrote in his personal log, found years after his death. "The light there is wrong. My lens fogged, though the air was dry. It felt like standing inside a breath." He took only one exposure, a daguerreotype later recovered from his estate. The image shows a stretch of broken fencing and the shadow of a tall man standing beside a horse-shaped outline. Both are slightly blurred, as if moving during the exposure, but Riggs's notes insist no living thing was there. Beneath the plate, written in pencil, he scrawled, "Dodge City, 1924. I think he's still working." The photograph never appeared in the exhibit. A few months later, the county hosted its first Pioneer Celebration, meant to honor Dodge's transformation from wild outpost to modern city. But during the festivities, a strange incident occurred. Several parade horses bolted suddenly near the eastern gate, breaking formation and galloping toward the Grieg plot. Witnesses described their movements as entranced, their eyes rolling wide as they reached the fence and stopped dead, as though meeting an unseen barrier. When the handlers reached them, the animals stood trembling, heads bowed, Brett, hing in rhythm, 3 short breaths, 1 long. It was the same pattern the older locals recognized, the hammer's rhythm. The sheriff chalked it up to noise from the marching band. But that night, 2 horses were found dead in their stalls, perfectly still, no injuries. The veterinarian, Dr. Owen Partridge, described their internal organs as collapsed, as though drawn inward toward a vacuum. His report vanished after being submitted. Meanwhile, the Wikipedia record of Dodge City's development in the 1920s notes a curious civic proposal, plans for a Memorial Garden near the Eastern Yards, which was suddenly withdrawn without explanation. Local rumor claimed the surveyors heard voices through their compasses, rhythmic tapping from underground. The project was abandoned. Around this same period, the old clerk Ellen Rourke, now nearly 80, returned to Dodge for a family funeral. She was frail but lucid, and when a journalist asked her about the legend of the doctor, she gave what became her final public words. He wasn't trying to kill anything. He was trying to keep the world from dying. But he forgot the part that makes us stop. The reporter dismissed it as senility. Ellen died 3 months later in her sleep, though neighbors said her body was found stiff and cold, but not pale. Her skin, they said, had darkened like tanned hide, smooth and unbroken. After her passing, Dodge City entered what locals called the good years. Businesses thrived, new roads opened, and talk of the doctor faded again into background noise. Yet those who kept watch, the station guards, the farmers, the school children walking home at dusk, swore that some nights, when the wind shifted east, the faint metallic tapping returned, steady and patient, beneath the hum of the electric wires. They said the past doesn't rest here. It only waits for the next man to dig deep enough to remember where the bones were buried. By 1927, the memory of Dr. Alistair Grieg had become less history than legend, a campfire story whispered by young men trying to frighten one another under the Kansas night. Dodge City was modern now. Telegraph wires stretched like black veins across the sky. Streetcars rattled past brick storefronts, and the new radio station promised a voice from nowhere. Yet, on quiet evenings, the people who lived near the eastern boundary still swore they could hear another kind of voice, softer, deeper, a hollow sound that came from below. That summer, a road crew was sent to widen the highway leading toward Meade. Their work brought them dangerously close to the condemned plot, though most didn't know the land's reputation. On the 4th day, the crew unearthed something unusual, a section of earth harder than the rest, shaped like a shallow dome. They broke through it with picks and found what looked like a cavity lined with bricks. Inside were metal instruments fused together by rust, and several preserved bones wrapped in what one worker described as hide too thick to belong to man or horse. The foreman, William Trace, sent a telegram to Topeka requesting an inspection, but by the time the county assessor arrived, the cavity had flooded overnight, though there'd been no rain. The inspector, irritated by wasted travel, closed the matter with a note. Underground drainage collapse, no further action required. That night, the road crew camped nearby. 2 men went missing before dawn. Their tools were found beside the trench, handles slick with oil. The others swore they heard hoofbeats fading eastward into the prairie, slow, deliberate, almost human in rhythm. The county's official stance was predictable. Workers lost in storm. But no storm had passed through Kansas that week. By autumn, the city erected a low concrete barrier along the highway to separate it from the condemned land. Travelers began calling it the Doctor's Wall. It still stands today, a dull gray curve that locals pretend not to notice. In that same year, a small pamphlet was printed by a Topeka university under the title Frontier Oddities, The Anatomy of the Dodge City Legend. The anonymous author, likely one of Professor Delmar's former students, described the Grieg story as a parable of ambition gone to rot, comparing it to tales of Frankenstein and early medical grafting experiments in Europe. The essay concluded, "It is said that the doctor sought a life so enduring that even the earth would not know how to consume him. If his work succeeded, he may still walk beneath the sod, carried by hooves that no longer remember rest." The pamphlet was quickly withdrawn after protests from the Dodge City Council. Only 3 copies are known to exist. Meanwhile, reports began circulating of horses refusing to cross the eastern road. Drivers said their engines sputtered as if choked by invisible hands. One man claimed that when his headlights struck the field, he saw dozens of impressions in the dust, prints shaped like hooves, yet with faint outlines of fingers curled at their centers. The Wikipedia record of Dodge City for this period speaks only of the city's progress, new infrastructure,
civic parades, the first municipal airport. Nothing about the wall, the road crew, or the strange accidents that delayed construction. But buried among the archives in Topeka, one unsigned government memo survives, written in a calm, bureaucratic hand. The anomaly persists. Recommends sealing the ground and denying public access. Whatever moves beneath is not mechanical, yet appears to follow rhythm. They sealed it with concrete that winter. But the locals said it didn't help. Because sometimes, if you stand by the wall at midnight, the air seems to tremble, with the echo of hooves striking buried earth. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. The sound of a man's persistence, working still. By 1930, Dodge City was no longer the town it had been. The Depression was tightening its grip across Kansas, and the once proud cattle hub had turned ghostly again. Empty storefronts, half-lit windows, dust blowing through the alleys like a language the earth had not forgotten. Only the rails still sang at night, that low moan of steel on steel echoing over the prairie. But near the doctor's wall, even the trains seemed to grow quiet, as though something in the ground absorbed the sound before it reached the sky. That spring, a new caretaker was hired to oversee the abandoned rail yard, a widower named Henry Paddock. He had come from Missouri, unaware of the field's history. Locals told him only one rule: never light a lantern facing east after sundown. He laughed, saying ghosts were for men with too much whiskey and too little work. The first week passed without incident. The second did not. In a letter later found in his locker, Paddock wrote, "I heard it tonight, the hammering they spoke of. Not far, just below, where the ground dips near the fence. It sounds like someone mending shoes or hooves. But when I called out, the sound stopped, as if waiting to see if I'd call again." He left his post the next morning, pale and trembling. 2 days later, he returned, saying he couldn't sleep elsewhere. "It's quieter here," he told the sheriff, "as if the noise belongs to this place and nowhere else." By May, he was gone completely. His cabin stood empty, bed neatly made, food uneaten. The sheriff's report notes that the front door was open and a faint odor of formaldehyde hung in the air. His boots were found by the wall, one upright, the other lying flat. Inside it, a single human tooth embedded in the leather. Around this same time, the Dodge City Clarion printed its last known mention of the old legend buried in the strange news column. Caretaker missing near Cohood. Indemnied land. Locals revived tales of the English doctor whose experiments once troubled this town. Sheriff insists natural explanation forthcoming. No such explanation arrived. The Wikipedia summary of Dodge City's early 1930s describes economic hardship, population decline, and several mysterious infrastructure delays attributed to ground instability near the Eastern Road. What it does not mention is the testimony of the railway engineer Samuel Webb, filed privately with county officials and never released until decades later. "We set stakes for new rail, and the next morning everyone was gone. Pulled out clean, no holes, just the shape of them left pressed into the dirt. And the ground itself, Lord help me, it moved, gentle-like, as though something large had turned beneath." After that, the rail expansion was canceled indefinitely. One night that summer, a traveling preacher passing through Dodge claimed he saw a light flickering by the wall. Thinking it a campfire, he approached to offer prayer to whoever lingered there. What he found was no fire, but a single lantern swinging from a nail, moving through the air was still. Beside it, impressions, man-sized, traced in dust alongside deeper prints shaped like hooves. The preacher ran to town, shouting that the doctor rides again, but by the time men returned with him, the lantern had gone cold. Only the smell remained, sharp, chemical, like smoke and medicine. In the months that followed, the town stopped talking about it altogether. The council ordered the area fenced for the final time. No one objected. They said silence was safer. And for a while, Dodge City slept. But sleep in this town was never without dreams, especially the kind that sounded like hooves beating from beneath one's own floor. By 1933, the Depression had hollowed Dodge City to its bones.
Dust rolled through the streets in waves thick enough to swallow sound, and the few families who stayed learned to seal their windows with newspaper and prayer. The air itself carried grit and memory. That spring, one of the worst storms in Kansas history swept across the plains, wind howling like it had come to reclaim everything men had ever built. When the dust settled, parts of the old doctor's wall had crumbled. The city sent a small crew to assess the damage. Among them was a young surveyor named Paul Everett, barely 20, eager to earn a day's pay. His report, written later that same night in the boarding house ledger, reads, "The fence was buried, the concrete cracked. Underneath it, empty space. Sounded hollow when struck. Mr. Greeley tried probing with a rod, but it wouldn't go more than a foot before bending. Smell of medicine, like old hospitals." 2 days later, Everett was gone. His bed was made, his boots by the door, and on his pillow lay a single folded scrap of paper with one word written in a careful, old-fashioned hand: reintegration. No one could explain how the handwriting matched samples from Dr. Alistair Grieg's original ledger, the same one locked for decades in the courthouse archives. The sheriff ordered the breach in the wall filled at once. Men poured concrete until dusk, and when they finished, they swore they heard a low thud from beneath, like a heartbeat trapped in stone. The sheriff told them it was their own nerves, but he refused to stand near the site himself. That night, a wind rose again, carrying fine dust in the faint rhythm of hooves. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. In the storm's roar, some said they heard a man's voice murmuring softly to the horses, as if calming them. The next morning, Dodge City looked the same as it always had. The dust had covered the new concrete. The walls seemed whole again. But when the courthouse clerk arrived to file the closure report, she found the basement flooded, the same basement where the Grieg records had been kept since 1884. All pages were dissolved into pulp except one, a list of supply orders for preservatives, sutures, and fresh hides. The final line was underlined twice, to ensure endurance. Over the following months, travelers passing through town began to tell small stories. Nothing dramatic, just the sort that stick in the mind. A farmer's daughter claimed she saw a man walking alongside a pale horse at dawn, both moving without sound. A station guard said his lantern kept swinging long after he'd set it down, as though something unseen brushed past it. A schoolteacher driving home after dark felt her car jolt, looked back, and saw hoof prints where no animal had been. The Wikipedia history of Dodge City ends its account of this era with optimism, the slow recovery, the rise of tourism, the town's rebirth as a symbol of the frontier spirit. But history, as written by men, is tidy. The earth beneath Dodge City remains anything but. Locals still say that when storms gather over the plains and thunder rolls low, it doesn't sound like thunder at all. It sounds like breathing. Some nights, if the wind is right, the smell of antiseptic drifts through the air, and you can almost see in the flicker of lightning the outline of a man in a long coat standing beside a horse, gloved hands folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. No one approaches him. They say if you do, the ground itself begins to stir, soft and wet, like something alive, remembering how to rise. And so the story of Dodge City remains unfinished, part record, part rumor, and part heartbeat beneath the dirt. The doctor's name has faded from every ledger, every archive, every sermon. Yet somewhere you enter the Kansas soil. A pulse still answers when the rain falls.